The moment I stepped through the heavy oak doors, a profound silence fell over the courtroom. It was the kind of quiet that feels louder than noise. A vacuum that sucks all the air out of the room. I saw my brother, Mark, the family's golden boy who wore his charisma like a shield, turn white as a sheet. He leaned over to our father, and I could read his lips, the whispered words sharp with panic. No. She can't be here. My mother simply raised a trembling hand to her mouth, her pearls catching the light. My father, Robert, a man who valued public perception above all else, refused to meet my gaze. His jaw was a hard line of fury and shame. He just stared straight ahead at the state seal on the wall, as if looking at me would make this all real. High on the bench, the judge's hand shook slightly as he flipped through the pages of a federally sealed file that had been placed before him just moments ago. I could almost hear the echo of his thoughts, the words that would soon be spoken aloud. This case was closed. Docket 78B was settled 12 years ago, but I wasn't there as a family member. I wasn't there to argue or plead. I was there as an officer of the court. 3 weeks earlier, the four of us were gathered in the sterile, glass-walled conference room of a wealth management firm. The family lawyer was droning on about the final disbursement of a trust fund, the very fund created from the ashes of a failed business venture from my youth. It was the final step in granting Mark sole control over the assets. My father clapped him on the shoulder, his voice booming with pride. See, this is what a real career looks like. Stability. Power. He then turned to me, a dismissive wave of his hand erasing my entire existence. Not like your little government accounting job. Bet you're still chasing paper clips in some basement. Mark just smirked, leaning back in his chair with an air of practiced magnanimity. Don't worry, Annie, he said, the nickname a deliberate jab. Once this clears, I'll make sure your car loan is paid off. My treat. The insult was so much more than the words. It was the memory of every ignored achievement. Every time money was tight for me, but flowed like a river for him. I said nothing. I just gave a slow, deliberate nod, my eyes cold and empty as I let the moment burn itself into my memory. He called me Annie, the nickname they gave me after I lost them all that money. He had no idea he was talking to senior investigator Miller, the woman. The DOJ calls when assets have been hidden for more than a decade. To understand the federal reckoning that was coming, you have to understand the lie they built 12 years ago. To understand that lie, you have to go back 12 years, to a stuffy lawyer's office that smelled of old paper and stale coffee. I was so much younger then, full of a fragile, brilliant hope about the tech startup I had poured my soul into. That hope was dying under the fluorescent lights. My father was pacing, his voice a low, disappointed rumble that echoed the lectures of my childhood. He wasn't yelling. That would have been easier. Instead, he spoke of shame, of embarrassing the family name, of the recklessness of my ambition. He made my dreams sound like a childish whim that had cost them everything. And my brother, Mark. He stood by the window, hands in his pockets. The very picture of reluctant sorrow. He'd look over at me with these deep, sympathetic eyes, but I could see the flicker of triumph he couldn't quite hide. He was my partner in the venture, the one who handled the books. He was also the one who, as I later discovered, had created a phantom trail of fake invoices and shifted funds just before our key investor pulled out. He manufactured a crisis and then positioned me at the center of the wreckage. They presented me with a choice that was never really a choice at all. Sign a settlement, take the blame, and let Mark salvage what was left. Or fight and tear the family apart in a public battle. I had no resources to win. So I signed. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely form the letters of my own name. I remember tracing the legal jargon with my finger, the clause that legally erased me. It granted Mark all rights to any and all recovered assets or intellectual property. With that single, shaky signature, I became a ghost in my own story, a cautionary tale they would tell for years. I was the naive daughter, the reckless failure. Mark was the responsible son, the one who cleaned up my mess. It was the perfect narrative, and I had just signed it into law. That was the world they built for me. It was a small, gray box, but it wasn't the world I lived in. My real world was a place they couldn't even imagine. It wasn't some boring basement office, it was a SCIF, a sensitive compartmented information facility, a place with no windows, where the only light came from the glow of 24 monitors and the only sound was the quiet hum of servers processing terabytes of global financial data. Here, the air tasted like cold, clean electricity, the taste of secrets. This was where I hunted the biggest financial predators on the planet, untangling their billion-dollar knots of fraud and deception. This was where my mind, the one my family deemed too flighty for a simple startup, could truly fly. I remember one night, staring at a complex web of transactions that had stumped our entire division for weeks. My boss, Deputy Director Evans, a seasoned, no-nonsense DOJ official who had seen everything, came and stood behind me. His presence was a quiet weight of authority and expectation. "Miller," he said, his voice low. "The target moved the assets through 3 shell core in the Caymans. We've hit a wall." I didn't even turn around. My eyes were locked on a single, flickering data point from a correspondent bank in Cyprus. "He didn't hit a wall, sir," I replied, my fingers already flying across the keyboard. "He used a debit-credit swap. It's an old trick to make funds look like they've vanished. The money isn't gone. It's just inverted." I isolated the transaction string, rerouting the trace. "Give me an hour." Evans just stood there for a moment, and I could feel his quiet, profound respect. He didn't offer advice or micromanage. He just trusted me. In my world, I wasn't the family failure. They called me the ghost, the one who could resurrect a dead financial trail and find the money that the world's most powerful criminals thought they had buried forever. The irony was a constant quiet hum in the back of my mind. My family had branded me a failure for losing $50,000 of their seed money, money my brother had actually stolen. Yet at my day job, I was leading the team that had just recovered over $200 million from an international cartel's money laundering scheme. They pictured me in a cubicle, buried in mundane spreadsheets and chasing paperclips. The truth was, I was balancing the scales of justice on a global level. They saw me as the girl who needed her car loan paid off. The federal government saw me as one of its sharpest weapons in the war on financial crime. I lived these 2 lives in parallel, never letting them touch because the chasm between their perception and my reality was simply too vast to bridge. For 12 years, I had accepted their version of the story because I thought peace was more important than truth. But when Mark tried to claim the last of the blood money, I realized peace was impossible without truth. It was time to declassify the past. After leaving that conference room, I didn't go home to rage or mourn the finality of my family's betrayal. There were no tears. The emotional part of me had simply switched off. Instead, I drove back to the office, the city lights blurring past me in streaks of cold indifference. I walked through the silent, empty hallways, my heels echoing in the cavernous space, and let myself into the secure sanctuary of the SCIF. The hum of the servers was a familiar comfort, the language of logic and order. There, I sat in the cool glow of my monitor and pulled up a file that had been dormant for 12 years. My own. I knew the state-level civil case was long since dead and buried, sealed by the settlement I had been forced to sign. But my family, in their arrogance, had forgotten the world I now lived in. They didn't know that the federal statute of limitations for wire fraud was a different animal entirely, and my brother's greedy attempt to access the final disbursement of the trust, that wasn't just a withdrawal. In the eyes of the U.S. government, it was a new overt act in a continuing criminal conspiracy. He had just personally reopened the door to his own past. My fingers moved with a cold, steady precision across the keyboard. There was no passion in it, only purpose. I began to draft a formal legal document, a petition for jurisdictional review and asset freeze. Into this document, I poured the evidence I had quietly gathered and held on to for years. I accessed the unredacted bank statements from the startup's collapse, the ones Mark never knew existed. There it was, in black and white, the interstate wire transfer from our company, account to a personal, hidden account he had opened a month prior. The money trail was clean, damning, and irrefutable. The next morning, I walked into the office of Deputy Director Evans. I placed the file on his desk without a word. He read it, his expression growing more grim with every page. When he finished, he looked up at me, his eyes filled not with pity, but with a cold, professional anger. "He used an interstate wire transfer to defraud you," Evans stated, his voice flat. "Then he used the settlement to launder the gains into a trust. This is textbook. It's clean." I kept my composure, my voice steady. "He's scheduled to take final possession in 3 weeks. At the probate court hearing." Evans stared at me for a long moment, the unspoken personal weight of it all hanging in the air between us. Then he gave a decisive nod. "Then we'll serve the court at that hearing." He pushed the file back towards me, his gaze firm. "This is no longer a family matter, investigator. It's a federal case." I took the file, printed the damning bank records, and signed the final page of the petition. Not as Annie, the family failure, but with the full weight of my title, Anna Miller, Senior Investigator, Asset Forfeiture and Financial Crimes Division. My family was preparing for a celebration. They were attending court to witness Mark's final victory. They had no idea that I had already filed a motion, and that the guest of honor at their party would be the United States Department of Justice. The probate courtroom felt more like a coronation than a legal proceeding. From my position at the back, hidden in the shadows by the heavy doors, I watched the scene unfold. My family occupied the entire front row, beaming as if they were royalty. My brother Mark was the king, shaking his lawyer's hand and accepting whispered congratulations from family friends. He was oozing a confidence so profound it was almost liquid, a tangible aura of victory that filled the room. The judge seemed to feel it too, shuffling through his routine papers with an air of detached boredom. This was all just a formality, a final rubber stamp on my brother's triumph and my family's carefully crafted legacy. Then, I pushed the doors open. The sound was not loud, but the sudden shift in light and the sight of me standing there sent a shockwave through the room. A wave of silence radiated out from my position, silencing the whispers and freezing the confident smiles. As I took my first step forward, my sharp, professional suit a stark contrast. To the celebratory attire of the gallery, another figure entered behind me, a uniformed U.S. Marshal, his presence an immediate and absolute disruption of the local court's authority. He carried a thick, federally sealed file. He didn't look at anyone, simply walked with a measured pace down the aisle, handed the file to the bailiff, who then placed it with a soft thud on the judge's bench. That small sound changed everything. The judge looked down at the official seal, then at me, then back to the file. He opened it, and I watched as the blood drained from his face. His entire demeanor shifted. The boredom vanished, replaced by a grave, focused intensity. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the dead quiet. He looked directly at Mark's lawyer. "Counselor," he began, his voice now stripped of all warmth, "this court has just received a federal petition that takes precedence. It alleges the assets in question, specifically the M Trust, are the proceeds of a federal crime." A gasp rippled through the pews. Mark's lawyer sputtered, but the judge held up a hand, silencing him before he could begin. The judge began to read from my affidavit, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. He never used my first name. He used my title, and the words echoed off the polished wood. According to the signed affidavit by Senior Investigator Miller of the Department of Justice, he laid out the entire conspiracy, his voice a steady, damning rhythm. He detailed the evidence of wire fraud from 12 years ago, citing the specific transaction numbers, the dates, the routing information I had uncovered. The original civil settlement, the judge concluded, his eyes boring into my brother, was predicated on fraudulent documentation, rendering it void. Objection. Mark's lawyer finally roared, finding his voice. Your Honor, this is a flagrant abuse of process. This is a family dispute. This woman is the defendant's sister. The judge slowly took off his glasses. He looked at the sputtering lawyer. Then he looked directly at me. Is the petitioner, Investigator Miller, present? I stood up, and my voice was as steady as my hand had been when I signed the petition. I am, Your Honor. And is the evidence in this file accurate? For the first time, I allowed myself to look directly at Mark. His mask of charm had shattered, revealing the terrified fraud beneath. All the years of being overlooked, of being the footnote in his story, coalesced into this single, clarifying moment of truth. It is, Your Honor, I said, my voice ringing with an authority he had never heard from me. The defendant's actions fall under Title 18, Section 1343 of the U.S. Code. My department requests an immediate and indefinite freeze on all assets pending a full federal investigation. The reaction was instantaneous and devastating. My father, a man who understood chain of command and the crushing weight of institutional power, looked like he had been physically struck. He finally understood. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, a choked sob escaping. But my eyes were on Mark. He was frozen, a statue of disbelief and sheer terror. His entire life, his reputation, the legacy he had stolen, it had all just been publicly and irreversibly dismantled by the boring government accountant he had so casually dismissed. The judge picked up his gavel, the wooden mallet seeming to weigh 1,000 pounds. He brought it down with a deafening crack. Asset freeze is granted. This hearing is adjourned, pending federal review. For 12 years, my name was synonymous with failure in their eyes. In the space of 5 minutes, my title had just made their name synonymous with fraud. The echo of the gavel seemed to hang in the air long after the judge had left the bench. The courtroom, once buzzing with my family's triumphant energy, was now a cavern of stunned silence. Court officers moved with quiet efficiency, clearing the room, their presence a stark reminder that this was now an official space, not a private theater for my family's drama. Mark was still frozen in his chair, his face a blank mask of shock, as the U.S. Marshal calmly served him with a federal subpoena and quietly instructed him not to leave the state. His lawyer was a frantic mess, whispering urgently into his ear, but my brother seemed to hear nothing. My family remained seated in the front row, shrunken and insignificant in the vast, empty room. They looked like strangers I had once known, figures from a faded photograph. All the power and prestige they had projected just minutes before had evaporated, leaving behind 3 small, broken people. I didn't feel a surge of victory or a bitter taste of revenge. I simply felt quiet. I calmly collected my briefcase, snapped the latches shut, and gave a respectful, formal nod to the judge's empty bench. Then, I turned and walked away from the wreckage of their lives without a single backward glance. Deputy Director Evans was waiting for me in the hallway, his posture as solid and uncompromising as ever. He didn't smile or offer a handshake. He just looked at me, his eyes conveying a deep, professional understanding that was worth more than any effusive praise. "Good work, Miller," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Let's go." It was the highest compliment he could give, and in that moment, it was the only validation I had ever needed. It wasn't about love or approval. It was about respect. It was an acknowledgement of my competence, my integrity, my work. It was everything I had been starved for, delivered in 3 simple words. 6 months later, the world was a different place. My world, anyway. The nameplate on my new office door was heavy, solid brass. The engraved letters. Sharp and clear, Anna Miller, Section Chief, Domestic Financial Crimes. I was at the head of a massive conference table, leading a briefing for a team of 12 sharp, focused investigators. They leaned forward as I spoke, their expressions attentive, their questions insightful. They challenged me, they respected me, and together we did work that mattered. This was my new family, one not bound by blood or dysfunctional obligation, but forged in the crucible of shared purpose and mutual respect. The consequences for my old family had been swift and severe. A quiet resolution handled in the sterile halls of federal court. As for my brother, Mark was indicted on 2 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of money laundering. Faced with irrefutable evidence and the prospect of a long prison sentence, he pled guilty. He forfeited the entire trust. Every last dollar built on his deception. He was sentenced to 5 years of probation and 5,000 hours of community service. My father's greatest fear had come to pass. The family name he had guarded so fiercely wasn't just tarnished, it was ruined. And the irony was that it was his own choices, his decision to elevate a lie over the truth, that had ultimately brought it all crashing down. One afternoon, an email popped up on my screen. The sender was my mother. The subject line contained just 2 words, "Your brother." I hesitated for only a second before I clicked it open. The message was short, a desperate, rambling plea for me to use my influence to help Mark, to lessen his sentence, appealing to the very idea of family that they themselves had broken. I read the words, and I waited for a feeling to surface. Anger, pity, satisfaction. Something. But nothing came. It was just noise from a distant world, a language I no longer spoke. The emotional ledger I had carried for so long was finally, blessedly empty. With a steady hand, I clicked the archive button, sending the message into a digital void without a reply. I turned back to the complex caseboard on my wall, picked up a marker, and drew a circle around our next target. A feeling of profound peace settling over me. My family tried to build a legacy on a lie they told about me. I built mine on the truths I uncovered about them. In the end, a name is only as strong as the integrity of the person who carries it.